Don't open that door. That's what I kept telling myself the whole drive to the hospital. Don't open that door because once you do, you can't close it again. I didn't know what I meant by that at the time. I thought I was just scared about my sister, 63 years old, and I was shaking like a kid. My sister Connie has been my whole life. I know that sounds like something people say at funerals, but I mean it the way you mean something when you've lived it. When our mother passed in 1904, it was just the two of us. I was 31. She was 28. We sat in that kitchen on Hooper Avenue in Compton, and we made a promise that we'd always show up for each other, no matter what. I kept that promise. She kept that promise. For 30 years, we kept that promise. For 30 years, we kept that promise. So when she called me in November saying she felt tired, I didn't panic. Connie had always pushed herself too hard. Worked double shifts at the post office for 15 years before she retired. Never sat still a day in her life. I told her to drink more water, get some rest, maybe see her doctor. She laughed at me the way only a little sister can laugh at you. Like you're sweet, but you don't know anything. By January, she wasn't laughing anymore. She was losing weight fast. Her hands were shaking during our Sunday dinners. She kept dropping things. Said her legs felt like they were filled with sand. Her doctor ran some blood work and said her electrolytes were off, maybe stress, maybe her thyroid. They adjusted her medication and sent her home. I drove her to every appointment. I sat in every waiting room. Something felt wrong to me, deep in my chest. The kind of wrong you can't explain to a doctor because there's no test for it. Her son-in-law, my nephew's husband, I'll call him the one who smiled too much. He was always there, always helpful, always offering to pick up her prescriptions, always volunteering to cook dinner when I couldn't make it over. His name is Damon. He married my nephew Eli 3 years ago. Nice wedding. Beautiful day. I shook his hand at the reception and thought, this young man is going to be good for this family. I was wrong about that. By February, Connie was in the hospital. They admitted her on a Tuesday. Her sodium levels had crashed so badly she could barely stand. The doctors were talking about her kidneys, her heart. They kept saying they needed more time to figure it out. I sat beside her bed and held her hand, and she looked at me and said, "Marvin, I'm so tired." Not tired like she needed sleep. Tired like she was thinking about giving up. That's the moment that cracked something open in me. My sister had never given up on anything in her life. I was standing in the hallway outside her room on the third day, drinking terrible coffee from a machine that charged me $2.50 and gave me something that tasted like warm regret, when a woman touched my arm. She was maybe 50, short, with close-cropped gray hair and reading glasses pushed up on her forehead. Her badge said she was the charge nurse on the floor. She looked left, then right, then at me. She said, "Are you Connie's brother? The one who's been here every day?" I said yes. She said, "Walk with me." We ended up in a small family consultation room at the end of the hall. She closed the door. She didn't sit down. She looked at me for a long moment like she was deciding something, and then she said, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer me honestly. Who prepares your sister's meals at home?" I told her Connie mostly cooked for herself. Sometimes I brought food over on Sundays, and Damon had been helping out since she got sick, bringing her things. Soaps, smoothies, supplements, he ordered online. The nurse's face didn't change, but something moved behind her eyes. She said, "Has your sister's condition been improving at home between hospital visits, or has it been getting worse each time she comes back?" I thought about it. Really thought about it. And the answer came over me like cold water. Worse. Every time she came home from a doctor's visit, she came back to the hospital worse than before. The nurse said, "I'm not supposed to be having this conversation with you, but I have a sister too." She paused. "We ran an expanded tox screen this morning. There's something showing up that shouldn't be there. Something that doesn't come from her medications, doesn't come from her diet." She stopped again. "I can't tell you the results. That has to come from the attending physician. But I'm asking you, as a family member, not as a patient's brother, to think very carefully about who has had access to her food and her supplements over the past 4 months. She left the room before I could say anything. I stood there with my terrible coffee going cold in my hand, and I felt the floor tilt underneath me. I want to tell you that I immediately knew what to do. I want to tell you I was sharp and clear and calm. I was none of those things. I sat in that little room for 20 minutes and just breathed, because the thought forming in my head was so ugly, so completely against everything I believed about family, that I couldn't let it fully form at first. I kept pushing it away. I kept thinking, no, not Damon. He loves Eli. He loves this family. But I also kept thinking about the supplements. Damon had started bringing Connie supplements around October. Said he'd read about them online, some regimen for energy and immune support. Had them shipped directly to her house. She'd mentioned them to me once. Said they were a little bitter. But Damon had gone to all that trouble, so she kept taking them. I hadn't thought anything of it at the time. People take supplements. It's America. Half the country is taking something someone on the internet told them to take. I called my nephew Eli from the parking lot. I didn't tell him everything. I told him the doctors were running additional tests and asked him to come to the hospital. He was there within the hour. He's a good young man, Eli. 29 years old, works as an electrician, has his mother's stubbornness and his grandmother's laugh. He came in with his jacket half-zipped and his eyes already red from crying on the drive over. I took him aside before we went in to see Connie. I asked him very carefully where the supplements Damon had been bringing his mother came from. He said he didn't know exactly. Damon had handled all of that. I asked if Damon was still bringing them even now that she was in the hospital. Ellie said yes. Damon had brought a fresh batch to the house just last week, said they'd help her recover faster when she got home. Something locked into place in my chest, hard and cold and absolutely certain. I went back to the charge nurse. I told her what I knew about the supplements. She listened without writing anything down. Then she picked up her phone and made a call. Within 2 hours, a man in a gray blazer and a hospital security badge came to the waiting room and introduced himself as someone who worked with the county's patient safety unit. He had the calm, patient voice of someone who had heard terrible things before and had learned how to keep his face still while hearing them. His name was Howard. That's all he told me. Just Howard. Howard asked me to walk him through everything I knew. The timeline, the supplements, the pattern of Connie getting worse at home and better in the hospital when she was on IV fluids and hospital meals only. He listened to all of it. He asked careful questions. Then he asked me something I wasn't expecting. He asked if Damon stood to benefit financially from anything related to Connie. I had to sit with that, because the honest answer was yes, in a way I hadn't let myself think about. Connie owns her house on Magnolia Street. She bought it in 2003, paid it off in 2019. It's worth somewhere around $420,000 in today's market. She has a life insurance policy she took out decades ago. Illy is the beneficiary on most of it. But Eli and Damon had been married 3 years, and California is a community property state. I'm not a lawyer, but even I understood what that meant. Howard thanked me and asked me not to discuss our conversation with Damon or anyone in Damon's immediate circle. He said to act normally. I almost laughed at that. Act normally. I had to drive home that night and eat dinner and sleep in my bed knowing what I knew and act normally. I didn't sleep. I lay in the dark and I thought about every conversation I'd ever had with Damon. I thought about how he'd been the one to suggest Connie stop going to her regular doctor and switch to a new practice closer to her house. Said it was more convenient. The new practice didn't have her full medical history. I thought about how he'd always been the one to pick up her prescriptions when I couldn't. I thought about the time he'd called me, very gently, very kindly, to suggest that maybe Connie was getting older, and maybe I should think about what kind of long-term care options existed. Eli had only been married to him 2 years at that point. I'd thought he was being thoughtful. He had not been being thoughtful. 3 days later, Howard called me. He said they had been in contact with the attending physician and that a formal investigation had been opened. He said he couldn't share details. but he asked me to come in. When I got to the hospital, there was a woman there in addition to Howard. She introduced herself as a detective with the county sheriff's department. Her name was Sandra. She was about 40, direct, no wasted words. She told me the tox screen had found elevated levels of a compound in Connie's blood that is used in certain rodenticides and industrial applications, and that is illegal for consumer purchase in the United States. It causes neurological symptoms, weakness, hair loss, kidney damage. They can mimic other conditions for months before doctors know to look for it. She asked me if I knew Damon's daily routine. I told her what I knew. He worked from home, consulting work, something with logistics. Was home most of the day, had easy access to Connie's house, because Eli had given him a key when they got married. They asked if I would be willing to continue acting normally. Call Damon, check in about Connie, see if he planned to visit the hospital. I said yes. I called him that evening. My hands were shaking when I dialed. He answered on the second ring, warm and concerned, asked how Connie was doing, said he'd been worried sick, said he was planning to bring some things by the hospital the next morning. I told him that would be real nice. I kept my voice steady. I don't know how. Maybe 30 years of showing up for people when it's hard teaches you something about keeping yourself together when everything is falling apart. The next morning I was at the hospital by 7. Howard was there. Sandra was there with 2 other people I didn't know. We waited. Damon arrived at 9:42. I know the exact time because I watched it on the clock above the nurse's station. He came in through the main entrance with a cloth tote bag and a smile. The kind of smile that had fooled me for 3 years. He never made it to Connie's room. Sandra and her partner met him in the corridor by the elevators. I watched from 30 feet away. I watched him look at their badges. I watched the smile disappear. I watched him try to say something and then stop. They took the bag. They asked him to come with them. He looked around. I think he was looking for Eli. And then he looked down the corridor and he saw me. We looked at each other for about 4 seconds. I don't know what he expected to see on my face. Maybe shock. Maybe I'll handle this. I didn't give him either one. He was taken out through a side entrance. I found out later the bag contained a thermos of broth he prepared at home that morning. I had to tell Eli. That was the hardest thing I've ever done. Harder than the arrest. Harder than the waiting. Harder than all those nights lying awake. I sat down with my nephew in a family lounge off the main corridor and I told him everything. All of it. From the charge nurse to Howard to Sandra to the moment in the hallway. Eli didn't say anything for a long time. He just sat there with his hands on his knees. He's built like his father was. Broad-shouldered. Solid. And he just sat there looking at the floor like the floor had something to say. Then he said, "How long?" The detective told us later that based on what they found, it appeared the exposure had begun sometime the previous October, roughly 4 months. Long enough to do serious damage. Not quite long enough to do what Damon had intended. He had intended to let her slip away quietly. Have it look like her health had simply declined. Be the grieving son-in-law. Inherit alongside Eli. Walk away with close to $200,000 in equity and insurance, depending on how things were structured. 4 months. He had watched my sister lose weight and lose strength and lose her spark for 4 months, and he had kept smiling and kept bringing supplements and kept offering to help. Connie spent another 3 weeks in the hospital after that. The treatment, once they knew what they were treating, was slower than any of us wanted, but it worked. She lost some hair. She still has numbness in her fingers that the doctors say may take a year or more to fully resolve. But she walked out of that hospital on her own 2 feet in March. I was standing right there when she did. She grabbed my arm in the parking lot and we just stood there in the sun for a minute. She said, "You were always the stubborn one." I said, "I thought you were the stubborn one." She said, "We both got it from Mama." And we laughed, and it wasn't because anything was funny. It was because we were still there, both of us, still keeping the promise we made in that kitchen on Hooper Avenue 30 years ago. Damon was charged with poisoning with intent to commit great bodily injury and attempted murder. His case is still moving through the courts. I go to every hearing. I sit in that room, and I look at him and I think about the smile he had when he walked into that hospital with a thermos full of poison, and I feel something that I don't have a clean word for. It's not just anger. It's grief, too. Grief for who I thought he was. Grief for what Eli lost. Not just the marriage, but the years of believing someone loved his family. Eli is doing okay. He moved back into Connie's house for a while to help her recover. And I think it was good for both of them. He doesn't talk about Damon much. Once in a while, he'll say something. Usually something practical, like they need to change the locks again or he has to call the lawyer. And I don't push him further than that. He'll process it in his own time. His mother's stubbornness, like I said, I want to say something directly to you, because I've thought about this a lot in the months since. The nurse who stopped me in that hallway took a risk. She didn't have to say anything to me. She could have let the system handle it in its own time, in its own way. She chose to look at me and make a judgment call based on nothing more than the fact that I had been there every single day and she had a sister too. I think about that. I think about what it means to step outside your lane because something isn't right and you know it, and you can't unknow it. There are people in your life right now who love you that way, who would walk to the end of a corridor and close a door and take a risk for you. Hold on to those people, and there are other people. People who bring you soup, people who offer to help, people who smile too much, who are not what they appear to be. I'm not saying live in fear. I am saying pay attention. Your gut knows things before your brain catches up. When something feels wrong, even when you can't explain it, even when everyone around you says you're being paranoid, write it down. Ask the question. Make the call. My sister is sitting on her porch on Magnolia Street right now. Her tomato plants are coming in. She called me this morning to tell me the mockingbird that nests in her sycamore tree is back, and she considers that a personal victory. She is stubborn and funny and still mad at me for worrying too much. I would not trade that phone call for anything in this world. I keep coming back to something Connie said to me once, years before any of this happened. She said, "Marvin, you can't protect people from everything." She was right, I know that. But what I've learned is that there's a difference between protecting someone from everything and simply paying attention, simply refusing to look away when something doesn't add up. Damon didn't get away with what he did because he was clever. He got away with it for 4 months because he understood that kindness is a disguise most of us never think to look behind. He smiled. He helped. He showed up. And in a world where so many people don't do those things, we stop questioning the ones who do. That's not a weakness in us. That's something good in us being used against us. And when I understood that, I stopped feeling foolish for trusting him. I started feeling something else. A quiet, steady anger at the idea that decency can be weaponized, that it was, in this case, by a man who sat at our family table and passed the sweet potatoes and knew exactly what he was doing. What saved my sister wasn't luck. It was a chain of choices made by people who decided to act on what they knew even when it was inconvenient, even when it cost them something. That nurse didn't have to stop me in that hallway. She had a job to protect, procedures to follow. She stepped outside all of that because her sense of right wouldn't let her stay quiet. That took something, a kind of moral backbone that doesn't come from a manual, doesn't come from a policy. It comes from being the kind of person who has decided, somewhere along the way, that doing nothing is also a choice and they're not willing to make it. I think about that when people ask me what I would tell someone in my position. I always say the same thing: trust what you know, not what you hope, not what's convenient, what you actually know. There were signs I let myself explain away, because the alternative was too painful to look at directly. The pattern of her getting worse every time she came home, the supplements I never examined, the doctor switch I accepted without asking why. Every one of those moments was my gut trying to tell me something my brain wasn't ready to hear. I wish I had listened sooner. I can't change that. What I can do is say it plainly to you. Your instincts are information. Take them seriously. And when the truth finally came, when it required me to make that call to Eli, to sit across from my nephew and dismantle the life he thought he had, I understood something about endurance I hadn't before. Getting through hard things is not about being fearless. It's about being willing to do what needs doing even while you're afraid. Eli got through it. Connie got through it. I got through it. Not because we're exceptional people, because we kept showing up for each other the way we always had. That's the whole thing, really. Show up. Pay attention. Tell the truth, even when your hands are shaking. That's what kept my sister alive. That's what kept our family together. And that's the only lesson I know how to offer anyone who's sitting with something heavy right now and wondering whether it's worth the trouble to say something. It is. That always is.